When students take standardized tests, they are not alone. In the room with them are the ghosts of the racist men from long ago who first created these tests. The achievement tests that students take today represent a continuation of 100 years of racism. Hello, my name is Dr. David Locke. I'm an educator and author of the book Crisis in Our Schools. Over the years, I've seen firsthand how standardized testing has harmed students, teachers, and schools, and I now feel an urgent need to speak out. In this video, I'll share a story from the first chapter of my book about the deeply racist origins of standardized testing in the U.S. and of some of the tragic consequences it's brought. In follow-on videos, I'll dig into the shocking weaknesses of standardized tests and the immense damage they're still doing to our children today. Modern standardized testing began with Alfred Binet in France. In 1905, he created the first IQ test to identify children who might benefit from special education services. But Binet also gave two very important warnings. First, he said the test could never measure intelligence, which is far too varied and complex to be captured by a test or represented by a number. Second, and most importantly, he said the test should never be used to compare students from different cultures, because tests are always biased in favor of whatever culture develops them. Binet's advice was sound, and it is sad that we didn't follow it. Instead, in 1908, American psychologist Henry Goddard introduced Binet's IQ test in the United States with the sole goal of using it to prove that white people with Northern European backgrounds, like himself, were superior. Completely ignoring Binet's warnings, he twisted the IQ test into a tool for racist propaganda. Goddard was motivated by an ideology known as eugenics. Eugenics, a racist movement from the early 20th century, promoted the idea that a nation's population could be improved through selective breeding, just like farmers do with livestock. Eugenicists believed that poverty, crime, addiction, and other issues were genetic. They claimed society could solve these problems by preventing unfit people from having children. One core belief of eugenics was that the characteristics of unfit people were intertwined. They thought individuals with low IQs, who they labeled as feeble-minded, were also immoral, violent, unclean, and prone to disease and addiction. For eugenicists, the IQ test was the ideal way to identify who was fit or unfit. In their view, people with low IQs were inherently flawed, while those with higher IQs were fit. They also believed that certain races and ethnicities had superior genes and were more intelligent than others. They considered white people from Northern Europe the fittest, while viewing all other groups as inferior. At its core, eugenics was rooted in pure racism. Eugenics was widely popular in the early 1900s, especially in the United States and Germany. Eugenicists in both countries stayed in close contact, sharing strategies for reducing the number of unfit people. In Germany, these ideas contributed to Adolf Hitler's rise to power and his push for a so-called superior German race, which ultimately led to the Holocaust. In the U.S., eugenicists took a different approach, centering their efforts on a three-step plan that relied heavily on standardized testing. First, building support. They organized meetings, rallies, and informational sessions nationwide to gain public backing. Second, collecting data. They used standardized tests to collect scientific evidence about who was fit or unfit. Third, passing laws. They used this evidence to push for eugenics-based laws. Their efforts paid off, and eugenics gained immense popularity, drawing support from influential figures like Theodore Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller, and even Helen Keller. At their massive conferences, eugenicists debated the ways to implement their unapologetically racist vision. To promote their ideas, they even organized perfect child contests at state fairs, where families competed over who had the most genetically perfect child. In their minds, this meant being blonde, white, attractive, and of Northern European descent. To provide so-called scientific evidence, that immigrants from certain countries were unfit, Henry Goddard administered his IQ test to immigrants arriving on Ellis Island. He ignored first-class passengers who might perform well and only tested lower-class travelers from steerage, who had just endured an exhausting journey in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Upon arrival, these immigrants were tagged and then led into a large hall filled with a confusing maze of lines. Over many hours, they had their belongings checked, underwent medical examinations, and faced multiple interviews. After this grueling ordeal, Goddard administered his bias test, ignoring the immigrants' lack of English skills, varying educational backgrounds, and complete unfamiliarity with the testing process. He also ignored their fatigue from the journey and the biases within the test itself. Based on the flawed results, Goddard concluded that 80% of Hungarians, 83% of Jews, 79% of Italians, and 87% of Russians were, quote, feeble-minded and therefore unfit. He published these false findings, and the American public accepted them as scientific proof that immigrants from Southern Europe were unfit. In response, calls for immigration restrictions grew louder, and in 1924, eugenicists pushed through an immigration act that welcomed immigrants from Great Britain and Germany, but severely limited immigration from Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe. The eugenicists had achieved their goal of restricting immigration from countries they considered unfit. But their efforts didn't stop there. In 1916, Lewis Terman developed the Stanford-Binet IQ test, which became the gold standard in the United States. Like Goddard, Terman used his test to promote his eugenicist beliefs, claiming it showed blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans were inferior. Once again, the public accepted this fraudulent data, leading to a push for the forced sterilization of those labeled unfit. During the 1920s, states began passing laws that legalized involuntary sterilization for people with low IQs. As intended, these laws disproportionately affected poor people and minorities. Terman's IQ test became a primary tool in determining who would be sterilized. Questions quickly arose about whether these sterilization laws were constitutional. In 1927, the Supreme Court heard a case from Virginia called Buck v. Bell to decide if it was lawful to sterilize people with low IQs. The plaintiff in the case was a 21-year-old woman from Virginia named Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck's story illustrates the unimaginable cruelty behind eugenics. Her life was marked by suffering and injustice, but also remarkable resilience. She was born in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1906. Several years later, her father abandoned the family, leaving Carrie, her mother, and her sister homeless and impoverished. Eventually, Carrie's mother was placed in an institution for the feeble-minded, a common fate for the homeless at that time. Carrie herself was taken in by John and Alice Dobbs, who treated her more like a servant than a family member. She attended school as an average student through the 6th grade and was then hired out to neighbors for menial labor. At 17, Carrie was raped by the Dobbs' nephew Clarence and became pregnant. Fearing the social and legal repercussions, the Dobbs falsely reported that Carrie was feeble-minded, arranging her commitment to the same institution as her mother. Her newborn daughter Vivian was taken from her and placed in foster care with the Dobbs. When eugenicists sought a prime candidate for a Supreme Court test case, they chose Carrie Buck because she, her mother, and her daughter had all been labeled feeble-minded. So besides enduring rape, being removed from her home, losing her daughter, and being institutionalized, Carrie also faced public humiliation. In one of its most shameful decisions, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against Carrie Buck, upholding Virginia's sterilization laws. Writing the majority opinion, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, "It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Following Virginia's example, 30 states passed laws allowing the forced sterilization of unfit people. As a result, between 50,000 and 60,000 Americans were sterilized against their will, with the last taking place in the 1970s. After her sterilization, Carrie was finally deemed safe to return to society. She remained separated from her daughter Vivian, who tragically died at age 9 from complications due to measles. 5 years after her sterilization, Carrie married a widowed carpenter with 6 children and went on to lead a long, productive life. When asked about the eugenicists responsible for her sterilization, she simply said that they had done wrong by her and the others. Carrie Buck passed away in 1983 and was buried beside her daughter. Around the time Carrie was sterilized, the college board chose eugenicist Carl Brigham to create a new IQ-like test focusing on academics, to be named the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT. Brigham was selected because of his book, A Study of American Intelligence, where he infamously warned against the menace of racial deterioration. Brigham's SAT was biased from the outset, using a review process that excluded questions where black students did well and included questions where white students excelled. Despite this inherent bias, the SAT became essential in college admissions, while the SAT and IQ test became the models for all standardized testing in the U.S. Although intentional biases may no longer be present, modern standardized tests still consistently show a significant bias against poor and non-white students. Eugenics remained influential in the U.S. until the early 1940s, with eugenics laws preventing many Jews from immigrating to escape concentration camps. But when Germany surrendered at the end of World War II, the world learned of the horrors of the genocide of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and the American public finally woke up to the horrors of eugenics. The movement became associated with Nazism and quickly faded or went deep underground. Even though eugenics became discredited, Americans continue to trust the test created by eugenicists. Today, many still believe in the value of standardized testing, despite mounting evidence that these tests are biased, ineffective, and largely produce meaningless data that harm students, teachers, and schools. I'll discuss this further in follow-up videos. Thank you for watching. For a deeper dive into these issues and other educational topics, please subscribe to this channel or check out my book, Crisis in Our Schools, available on Amazon. I'll include a link in the comments.